Jeffrey es facilitador principal de Singularity University, aporta un enfoque interdisciplinario y orientado a sistemas para explorar la cuestión de lo que significa vivir y liderar en una era de cambio acelerado. Jeffrey es un educador multimodal y catalizador de conversaciones, un orador, facilitador y diseñador de programas que crea experiencias de aprendizaje únicas, impulsadas por la narración, la colaboración y el juego. Regularmente conecta puntos e ideas para compañías Fortune 500 y audiencias de C-Levels como moderador frecuente de programas de educación ejecutiva inmersiva y grandes cumbres internacionales. Jeffrey colabora con frecuencia con el grupo Be Radical de Pascal Finette y ha sido conferencista invitado y facilitador en universidades como Berkeley, Stanford, entre otras. Welcome, Jeffrey. Thank you very much for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for having me. And I am always thrilled to join after Vivian. I'm assuming you're all pretty fired up now about the possibility of creating the future, building for the future. And now I want to talk with you briefly about how we might be able to do that, right? How we can engage in that project as innovators, as entrepreneurs, and as the future leaders of organizations. So I'd like to start by suggesting that if you're going to be building for the future or building the future, you shouldn't be limiting yourself to today's tools. Vivian has already talked to you a little bit about the importance of thinking about and embracing the tools of tomorrow to build tomorrow. And she's told you a little bit about the exponential advance of technology, and particularly highlighted this idea of Moore's law and the exponential increase in the price performance of computation that we've been watching now for more than half a century. And I want you to consider something. Ask yourself if you could go back in time, or if we could all go back in time right now, and we could present some of what Vivian just shared with maybe your parents or my parents. Imagine if we could go back to 1970 and we could show them something like this. And this is a chart that shows that smooth exponential increase of the price performance of computation from the late 1970s through to the present. And if you showed it to them, and if you told them that this was going to be one of the most profound trends that becomes a driving force, shaping the global economy, shaping society, shaping culture, shaping day-to-day life, first, they probably would be like, wait, what? You're from the future? And second, they might start to think a little bit differently from that point of 1970 about the course of their career, maybe the course of their investments, maybe the kinds of solutions that they plan to build and the kinds of futures that they want to create, because they would be able to see a pathway towards something entirely different. They would see a window onto alternate possible futures. And basically, Vivian opened that window for all of you, because for some of the other technologies that she talked about, we're still very early on that curve. So it's important to understand why these things work the way that they do and how we're going to be able to use these future tools and why it's so important that we do. The first thing to understand here is that computers didn't get faster and more powerful and cheaper and more accessible just by magic. They increased in their price performance because we produced a whole lot more of them. We started to put computation into everything. Computers started to become ubiquitous, and the more we produced, the better we got at producing them. We were able to realize a learning or experience curve over time, so that as we produce more and more of something, we get better and better at producing it, and it gets cheaper, right? That's how price performance increases, and it is a function not of magic, but of demand and production to meet demand. And this is something that actually holds true for a lot of technologies. And in fact, we first realized this in the mid-20th century. A researcher named Theodore Wright was looking at the growth of the airline industry. And he found that for every doubling of global manufacturing capacity, we realized a 13% decrease in cost, right? So the price performance over time increases as we produce more and more of something. And it turns out that this trend holds for a lot of technologies. As we increase global manufacturing capacity, as we make more and more of the thing, as we put it into more of our solutions, more of our businesses, more of our day-to-day lives, these tools become cheaper. They become more powerful. They become easier to use. This holds for a lot of clean energy technologies, for the production of solar cells. This holds for the batteries that power our electric vehicles. And I want you to think about this as well. As these things become cheaper, that starts to unlock new markets and unlock new demand. All of a sudden, something becomes affordable for me, so maybe I buy it. And then as I buy it and more of my friends buy it, then we're increasing manufacturing, and then those things start to get cheaper as well. So we hit tipping points that realize these positive feedback loops over time. And so the more we produce of the things that we use, the cheaper they're going to get to produce in the future. And that's really important when you think about building a business, building around a solution that is going to scale over time. That is the beauty of designing with the future's tools. This even holds true for some things you might not expect. As Vivian suggested, there are certain types of genomic sequencing that also, as we increase the number of sequences that we run, we're going to be able to do this stuff more cheaply and more easily and more accessibly. And it holds for all of these interesting technologies that you might think about incorporating into your future solutions. And again, if you can, then you can start to imagine a future where that solution is going to scale exponentially with the development of that technology, which is a pretty great thing. And we can see how this might work as we start to imagine how it would apply to particular industries and particular types of solutions. Vivian talked quite a bit about the exponential growth in the performance of artificial intelligence systems. And so I'm going to very quickly just suggest that here too, where we have a nice graph that shows effectively the size of the training data, the computational throughput that's going into developing the latest AI systems, the state of the art over the last 10 years, you can see that you have like a, whoops, got ahead of ourselves there. You can see that you have a nice exponential trend here where you have a 300,000 time increase in that computational throughput. And what that means for us is that our AI systems are effectively doubling in their power, not every 2 years, like computation with Moore's law, but something more like every 4 to 6 months, right? And so we can start to ask ourselves, what does this actually mean? What does it mean if we continue to pursue these trends? And in fact, the folks who put this graph together over at OpenAI, which is a think tank in San Francisco, these researchers said, so long as this trend continues, it's worth preparing for the implications of systems far outside today's capabilities. So we should ask what that looks like. And Andrew Ng, who was AI professor at Stanford, he started Coursera. He's been involved with the expansion and development of AI capabilities at Google and also Baidu. He used a useful metaphor that helps us imagine what this might be like when he's talking about these future tools. And he says that AI is basically going to be the new electricity. And that metaphor is interesting when we think about the history of electrification. And when when electricity was introduced, it wasn't just a new tool, it became a new paradigm. And it was slow to take hold. In fact, at first, manufacturers and factory owners weren't entirely sure how to use this and how different it was from steam power. And only gradually did they start to get away from the old way of doing things and start to understand what electricity made possible as a paradigm. And indeed, it changed the way that we did just about everything. You could start to use power anywhere. And you could also start to use it in small amounts, more or less on demand, in a way that would never have worked, generating that power from steam. And that new paradigm changed the way that we produce things. It changed the way that we live. It changed the way that we work. It changed the way that we design our cities. There's a whole lot that followed on from it. And now I want all of you to be thinking about what kinds of changes these future tools create for you, how they change the way that you might do things. And in fact, I like to think periodically about how these technologies will change the way that I do things. And so I go out and I find one and I play with it. And so I've been very interested over the last couple of years as I was hearing about the development of these new AI systems and new language learning models based on deep learning neural networks. And there was one in particular that was released by the think tank I mentioned a moment ago, GPT-2, that was supposed to be at the time the most amazing language learning network ever produced. And it turns out it's something you can play with online. And so I found a way before meeting with you all today to check this thing out over at TextSynth. And I thought maybe I could get this language learning model, which predicts and generates text, maybe I could get it to help me write this talk. So I went and I found this and I entered into the prompt there, something that maybe would give me something to work with. And let's say we enter the key to designing a better future is, and we hit complete text. And this language learning model, which basically digested the internet and got really, really good at spotting patterns and predicting what would come next when you gave it a little bit of text. Well, here's what it came up with for our talk today. I'm going to zoom in on this so you can see. It says the key to designing a better future is to bring together not just the best ideas, but also the best people. So far, I like it. Last week, I delivered the keynote to an audience of more than 40 powerful entrepreneurs and contributors who brought together around the world to discuss their approaches to the challenges of an increasingly complex world. That's a little weird, but it's still pretty good. The message was clear. We all have a role in making the future you want, and we can work together to overcome it. The unique opportunities presented by open source are inspiring. Getting a little bit creative here, but it still kind of works. And then it kind of goes off the rails at the end where it says, I have lived and worked in 70 countries since 2010. That's actually not true of me. It's certainly not true of this AI system. So this thing may not be ready to do my job just yet, but it's interesting to dive in and to explore what these tools are capable of currently, and then to imagine what happens when they get better and better. In fact, GPT-2, the system that this uses, is now a couple of years old. And the next generation, GPT-3, was built with about 100 times the training data and the number of parameters, and also now the power. So 2 orders of magnitude more powerful, and in fact, is being productized by Microsoft, which has a massive stake in OpenAI. So it's interesting to think about what this stuff can do today, what it's going to do tomorrow, and then what new opportunities that might create for us in the future. As we take in the scope of the expanding possible, we should be asking ourselves what new opportunities start to emerge. And this is actually harder to do than it sounds. So I want to give you an example here. And I want to go back in time again to see what we can learn from history as we're thinking about the future. And I'm going to show you a graph where you can see, starting from around the time that the first iPhone was introduced, this is the growth in daily hours spent with digital media. And that trend probably says a lot about where we've wound up as a society as we're consuming more digital media over time. I want you to focus, though, on the red part at the top of each bar. So that is the growth of mobile, as people start to consume more of that digital media on a mobile device rather than desktop, laptop, or other connected device. And I want you, looking at those red arrows at the top, to ask yourself, at what point would it have been clear to you that mobile was going to change the world, that everything ought to be designed mobile first? And I want you to be honest and look at this thing and ask, well, what about at 2010? Can I really see what's happening in 2010? That red bar is getting a little bit larger, but not that much. It's kind of hard to tell. What about 2008? It's really hard to tell because this has just started to be a thing with the smartphone. In fact, I've shown this to, at this point, probably thousands of leaders of different organizations around the world. And generally, if they're being honest, they say that they saw that mobile was going to be the future, really change the world, probably somewhere around 2011, maybe 2010. But here's the thing. If we didn't notice this until 2010, we would have really missed something important. We would have really missed the emergence of a tremendous future opportunity. And we would have missed a bunch of organizations that went on to shape our mobile world. And we would have missed these not by a few months, but by several years. The pioneers who really understood what this future opportunity was, they were seeing a different world from the rest of us. The good news is, I think we can train ourselves to see that world as we're looking at the future. We can train ourselves to see future opportunities like futurists. And it starts, as Vivian said, with understanding the way that technologies emerge and then change the world. And in a nutshell, it always goes like this. First gradually, and then suddenly. That is the nature of exponential change. And so what this means for you and for us is that we have to get good at seeing these things that tell us a big change is coming up, right? A big change is about to happen, and we want to position ourselves accordingly to be part of it, maybe even to drive it. So what we have to do is learn to see what foresight experts and some futurists call weak signals. Signals are the earliest indicators of what might become a trend. And we can start to see them. These are basically the pieces of the future that are already here. We can see these indicators that tell us, hey, something is happening. Something is open. Maybe there's an opportunity. Maybe the world is going to change. Some of those signals start to gather together. We get enough data points. They have some directionality. They suggest a trend. Some trends are going to go on to become more powerful, more prominent. They may become a driving force that really starts to shape and open up the future. Looking back, you can see that that growth in the price performance of computation over time is a huge driving force. But originally, it was just understood as a trend. And even before that, it was just a signal. And that's the same thing that we can see now with these other technologies. And as we learn to spot these weak signals, we can ask ourselves, what kind of futures do they suggest? What are the emerging opportunities? What are the new spaces? And then also, what are the emerging risks for the businesses that are operating today? And maybe how can we help them address and assess those risks? I'll give you a fun example of this to make it a little bit more real. One of my favorite signals to watch over the past couple of years has been the emergence of a trend of virtual beings, digital avatars popping up in interesting places. And this first became interesting to me when I came across Michaela Sousa, who many of you are probably familiar with. Michaela is a young Brazilian American. She's based in Los Angeles. She is a very popular Instagram influencer. I think she has about 3 million followers currently. My wife is one of them. Probably a lot of you follow Michaela as well. Here she is at the Silver Lake Dog Park in Los Angeles. I've been there many times, but I have never seen little Michaela there. And I think possibly I haven't seen Michaela, of course, because she is not real, right? Michaela is a digital rendering. She was produced, like many of these avatars, by a digital agency, this one called Brood in Los Angeles. And you can see here that while Michaela herself is digital, she interacts with real people in digital space. She promotes real products in digital space for you to buy, perhaps online, to then wear in the real world, right? She's sponsored by various labels. She's all over the place. She doesn't get COVID. She can travel anytime. She can be all around the world all at once. She is definitely a signal, right? And Michaela's been online for several years. We've seen now around the world a lot of other virtual beings like Michaela moving into advertising, moving into entertainment, moving into fashion. And she is a signal for the future of all of those industries as all of these things start to change and embrace an increasing level of digitization. But I think she's a signal for a lot more than that. And we can start to imagine, where does this stuff go beyond digital influencing and entertainment? And what does it mean for other businesses? And I would suggest that we can take a look at a business called AI Foundation, which is actually now starting to work with basically creating a Michaela Sousa-like version of any of you or any business leader, and thinking about making an AI-enabled digital rendering of anyone. Michaela currently isn't backed up by AI, right? If she interacts with people on Instagram, it's because someone is supplying responses. But imagine if little Michaela met a chatbot and they had a baby. That baby might be something like this, where you have an AI version of yourself or an AI version of, say, a celebrity or a business leader, and there is a chatbot effectively that has been trained on all of that person's data, all the things that they've said, that they've written, all of their blog posts, what have you. And then you can create effectively a digital version of yourself that could be put in an app. It could be put on a platform. It could interact with customers. It can have millions of parallel interactions every day and effectively help you learn, help your business learn from your stakeholders, from the people that you're trying to connect with, from the customers that you're trying to serve. So we can see that this also is something that becomes a new trend. And that this digitization of everything, including ourselves, is going to likely be a driving force, shaping the future of entertainment and all sorts of other industries as we move into a strange new world. And what I want you to do is to think about developing this practice of spotting weak signals, spotting these early indicators of change, and asking yourself, whenever you see something kind of strange like this, something interesting, where might this road lead? What might we find? And allow yourself to go down that road a little bit and explore possibility. And there's a systematic way for doing this that I like to do with my partners and also my clients. And we call it either the futures wheel or disruption mapping. It's something that foresight experts and futurists have been doing for a long time. It's a simple but powerful practice, and I want to share it with all of you because I think it's a great way to think about new opportunities, future opportunities, and also emerging risks. It works like this. You identify your signal or trend, and you can kind of put that at the middle of a paper or whatever it is that you're using to explore. In this case, it's on my iPad. And you ask yourself, well, if this thing continues, if this becomes real, what are the implications of that trend? What are the likely consequences? And we start to map out a couple of those. And then we ask, well, if those things happen, then what might be the implications of those implications? And as we work further from the known at the middle, where we are today and where we're imagining being tomorrow, into the unknown, further and further into the future, we find more of these cascading implications. We find more disruption as we move out. We also find out in those white spaces a lot of interesting opportunities, a lot of space for creative innovation and disruptive innovation. Let's take an example. I know Vivian already talked to you a little bit about autonomous vehicles, so that'll be a good one to use. So let's imagine a near future where autonomous vehicles become widely adopted. And let's start to see what that creates in our world. We can imagine some first order implications. If we have more autonomous vehicles on the road, we're likely to see a couple of things. We know that we're going to see a change to the use of urban space. We know that we're going to see a change to logistics and operations and shipping. We'll probably see fewer accidents eventually on the road if the rules of the road are programmed into all of the vehicles and they're all aware of each other and networked. We'll also, of course, see behavioral change because it's all real people who used to drive cars and now ride in them, and they're going to change the way that they interact with that technology and with that space. But now let's ask about the implications of these implications. What happens as we start to change the use of urban space? What does that look like? What opportunities does it create? Well, we'll probably see a decreased need or reliance on public transit, right? If the cost per mile goes down for all of these driverless vehicles, we can use them for whatever. We will likely see less need for parking lots. If you have autonomous vehicles that can always be in circulation, they finish one job, they go on to serve the next customer, the next use case. We'll probably see the emergence of new infrastructure in urban space as charging infrastructure becomes increasingly important. And now we can ask, well, what does this mean? Well, we might see the rise of private car fleets in places that used to rely on, on services with taxis or public transit or even individual drivers that were maybe working for a platform. Now the platform may own all of the vehicles. If we have less of a need for parking lots, we have the question, what do we really want to do with that space? This is a great opportunity to address that need and to address that imaginative space and think about how do we want to fill it? Well, hopefully, we'll see the greening of urban areas with an increase in parks and maybe even urban farms. What else? With that logistics change that we're imagining, we're probably going to see the cost per mile decrease as we can rely on more autonomous vehicles. And that is also going to enable us to kind of shift the paradigm in shipping and logistics to really be operating around the clock if we don't have to think about a human schedule. And that's going to have cascading effects for the labor force. As that cost per mile decreases, what might happen? Well, it might allow some businesses that previously would not have engaged a market because it was too far away, it didn't make economic sense. Well, that logic might change now, right? They might see an opportunity to expand there. And of course, if we are able to run these operations 24/7, you're going to have a cascading set of implications and consequences for the other humans that are involved in the labor force in shipping and logistics, right? As they will now transform and they will adapt to be part of that emerging system. and to work with those new tools and possibilities. What about on the top side? If we have fewer accidents on the road because the rules of the road are programmed into the vehicles, oh, well, I'll get to that in a minute. Let's start with behavioral change instead. What does this mean for the people who used to be drivers? If they're not driving now, well, we're going to be comfortable perhaps spending longer time in the car. That could lead to a change for our previous reliance on short-haul air travel, like commuter flights. If you're a business like in the United States, Southwest Airlines, that focused on those short-haul point-to-point commuter flights, you may find that your customers are now more comfortable spending a little bit longer in the car, right? Because they don't have to be behind the wheel. That time can become productive time. It can become recreational time. That also means that we might start to call cars for a lot more different things, as it no longer is just time behind the wheel, but it can be time for other things too, right? People become comfortable with longer commutes. We also might see an increase in the consumption of alcohol in cars, or at the very least, we'll probably see a decrease in the consumption of energy drinks. And we know that our friends at Red Bull are thinking about this, because for companies like Red Bull that sell a significant portion of their product at gas stations and convenience stores to drivers who are looking to stay alert behind the wheel driving into the night, well, they may not have that same need anymore. They might pick up a different beverage as we start to think about the car as a different kind of space. Maybe there's one for gathering, for socializing. We can imagine also that that is going to result in an opportunity for us to drastically reimagine the design of vehicles. What do they actually need to be? What can they be if they're not designed around a driver anymore? Now they can serve different uses, different customers, different possibilities. If we look at the implications of having fewer accidents on the road, we see some really interesting things. We're probably going to see a decrease in revenue for repair shops that did a lot of collision repair, right? If you're or your family operates a mom and pop repair shop, you should actually be paying attention to what is coming out of, say, the research in Waymo or some of these other driverless car tech companies, because that is going to change your industry dramatically at some point. It's going to be gradual and then it's going to be sudden, but that change is going to come. If we have fewer accidents, we're going to have fewer traffic speeding tickets and moving violations, which of course means a decrease in revenue for municipalities that relied on that in the past. So now they too have an emerging risk, but also an emerging opportunity to think about how they change their finances and how they embrace a new system around this possibility. If we have fewer injuries and deaths on the road, that's going to have some interesting implications as well. We're likely to see a decrease in hospital use and ER usage as we have fewer people coming off the road into emergency care. And if we have fewer brain deaths from traffic accidents, we're going to ultimately have fewer organs available for donation, which also creates an emerging risk. And then the flip side of that is an emerging opportunity for people in the biosciences and biotech to think about, well, how do we meet that need? What is the solution that allows us to meet that need? And how might we leverage some of the emerging biotechnology to produce that solution? And then, of course, there's going to be a change to insurance and insurance models. And I haven't even gotten into the possibility that Vivian raised, that you're going to see entirely new businesses built on the back of all of the real-time data that's going to be generated and collected by this fleet of autonomous vehicles as they become a bigger and bigger part of our future. And what I want to suggest here is that as we get further out, as we move into that white space, we start to see the opportunities, we start to see the risks, we start to see the potential for disruption coming suddenly from an unlikely source as it ripples out from the center. And I want to suggest that this tool, this practice of mapping disruption with the futures wheel, allows you to create quick forecasts within the context of alternate scenarios, to imagine new possibilities and see where they might go, to identify complex interrelationships, to understand how some of the pieces fit and how change in one sector might actually lead to a rippling change that's very dramatic somewhere else. That also suggests the importance of contextual awareness as we're thinking about new opportunities. This is going to allow you to build your awareness of those opportunities and risks as they emerge, and even start to anticipate them, to make this a habit of mind where you always start to ask yourself, Where might this lead? What are the implications of the implications? And then finally, I think this is a great way to surface assumptions about the future and also to generate new questions that we might ask. I think it's critical for the innovator and the entrepreneur to be asking new questions about tomorrow. And here's why. I believe, yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, Jeffrey. If we could start wrapping up, I would appreciate it, as we're a little above the hour.
Okay, sorry. I thought I had half an hour, but I can wrap up very quickly if you would like. Yeah, I believe that in a world of increasing complexity, a world of accelerating change, the value of a discrete answer choice, knowing the right way to do things right now, if the world around that answer is changing, the value of that knowledge is going to decrease over time. On the other hand, I think the value of an open-ended question, especially around your purpose rather than just a product, well, that's something that continues to yield dividends as we move into an uncertain future. And there are two types of innovation related to this distinction. On one hand, we have what's called sustaining innovation, which is basically generating slightly better answers to the same questions over time. And the flip side of that would be disruptive innovation, which we could think of as asking radically different questions to come up with radically different answers that are going to allow us to actually start to do things in entirely new and different ways, right? To realize creative breakthroughs and new possibilities. And I'm going to skip a bunch of things here and just suggest that there are certain types of questions that are particularly useful for opening up new creative possibilities and harnessing our curiosity to imagine a better future. These are what Warren Berger, the author, calls beautiful questions. He says they're questions that are not necessarily obvious, that are ambitious but also actionable, questions that can be answered. The types of questions that can shift perception and also shift our thinking, the way that we think about a business, the way we think about an industry, a sector, or a consumer need. A beautiful question is one that can be a possible catalyst for change. And a lot of these really great questions begin with a why, a what if, or how might we? And I think that as we're moving into this world of accelerating change and exponential technologies, this only becomes more important. And if we can get comfortable questioning things, experimenting and making new connections, then all of the change that we know we're going to experience becomes an adventure. It also becomes an opportunity to tell new kinds of stories. And I think that this is something our world critically needs right now. Stories are, of course, great tools for networking, scaling, connecting and sharing purpose, imagination, building community, learning, investigation, and influence. Stories also, from an evolutionary perspective, evolved, as this neuroscientist Lisa Krohn says, as sort of a dress rehearsal for the future. They allow us to imagine and try on new possibilities and see, is this a world that we would like to build toward? And if so, how might we go about doing it? And I think sharing those stories is a critical part of it. I'm just going to go ahead and wrap here. I know we're out of time. So I'm going to encourage you all, as you're thinking about the new narratives that you would like to share for the future, to embrace these future storytelling practices, to speak from your purpose, to paint a picture of a preferred future, one that is inclusive so that people can see themselves within it. And you empower the people who hear your story, you empower an audience, and you craft a clear call to action so that people know how to join you in building that future. And always to be asking yourself, as we're moving from 2020, which was a very difficult year for an awful lot of people who are now hungry for new stories about a better world, asking yourself, what does that world need? What does the future need? And I believe if you come up with a good answer to that question, you'll be well on your way to building something, to innovating toward a future that really matters. And with that, I will just say thank you, and sorry to be out of time.
No, on the contrary, Jeffrey, thank you very much for your presentation. Amazing what you tell us about the future, innovation, technology, etc. Sin más, voy a cerrar la reunión ahora. Los invito a que continúen con nosotros en la reunión de macroeconomía sostenible, y muchísimas gracias a nuestros dos ponentes, Jeffrey y Vivian Land, que nos acompañaron el día de hoy. Muchas gracias, y los invitamos a que continúen con nosotros.